Okay, so let me introduce Roger Nichols. And again, because we are very tight on time, we'll keep the introductions very short. So Roger, is a 5G and 6G manager at Keysight. Roger, is that good enough for you? And Roger, if you can take over and then introduce your next speakers. Thanks.
Roger, you're muted.
Roger, unmute, please.
And I promised myself I wouldn't do that. How's my sound now?
We can hear you.
Great.
Roger, thanks.
Thanks. Apologies. So the keynotes for yesterday and today at the beginning of the day both focused on the end beyond part of this event. And so the next 90 minutes or so, we're going to be talking about 6G and how that proceeds. And we're going to start with a couple of short presentations by John Smee, Vice President at Qualcomm, and by Charlie Zhang, a Senior Vice President at Samsung. I'm going to hand this over to John immediately, and then when John's done, he can just hand it off directly to Charlie, and then everybody stay tuned for a panel discussion that we'll have starting about 3:30 or so for a deeper dive in the topic with a few more panelists. Thanks. Go ahead, John.
Thanks very much. So I'll just share my screen here. All right. Well, it's certainly my pleasure to talk a little bit about where we're driving 5G and then how that sets the stage for 6G. Now, I'll say kind of begin by one of the really important things, even when we look at the transition timeline from 5G into 6G, is the reality is it's really not just about smartphones anymore. So when we looked at the 3G to 4G transition or the 4G to 5G, the interesting thing was 5G really expanded the cellular and mobile ecosystem to a lot of other new industries, whether it's agriculture, mining, education, healthcare, really looking at the value proposition for connectivity being much greater than just moving the bits around. And it's really about deriving value for a lot of these new applications and scenarios. And so that's kind of one of the interesting themes then, as we're looking at expanding 5G and continuing to drive that throughout the decade. And even if people, obviously, I'm holding in my hand here like a 28 gigahertz 5G smartphone. And it's very impressive that when we look at this acceleration of the speed of deployment, already 95 plus operators have 5G deployed, and 305 operators or more are already investing in 5G. So we're targeting 750 million plus smartphones to ship in 2022. So it really is a huge industry, and the 5G transition has been incredibly quick. And one of the other interesting things too, it's not just the smartphone, as was mentioned on the prior panel as well, things like fixed wireless access, things like always connected PCs, even tablets. And so what's exciting about 5G is not only it's this bringing connectivity to very powerful devices, but also the fact that the new ways that communication is being used is leveraging the fact that 5G is a significantly higher data rate, lower latency air interface. And so when we look at that global snapshot, so a lot of us on the spectrum side, particularly here at CWC, this aspect of the sub-6, the millimeter wave, the FDD, the TDD, the way in which these bands are working together with things like carrier aggregation. So whether we're looking at, USA, Europe, or Korea, Japan, China, India, entire globally, what's exciting is the speed with which 5G is approaching and evolving into new spectrum bands. And so one of the other aspects then is, what is the standards timeline? So we're in the midst of release 17 right now. Release 16 is finished. The smartphone I was just showing you is a release 15 smartphone. So we're going to see a lot more release 16 stuff coming onto market as well. And in that release 16, we expanded 5G into things like time-sensitive networking for industrial IoT, or even being connected vehicles with 5G V2X. Another very interesting part of release 16 was including things like 5G into unlicensed spectrum and new things like positioning and driving low power wide area. So we're already kind of driving further in release 17. I just saw CC from Qualcomm presenting on the work that's going on in XR. And so 5G and VR and AR is also a very powerful intersection. And so we're going to keep pushing 5G in release 17. And that takes us forward into release 18, 19, 20. So there's a lot of roadmap of interesting ideas coming that are going to drive this continued 5G evolution. And I think it would be remiss not to mention the fact that the evolution of 5G and even the upgradability of 5G is enabled partly by the fact that we're more in a virtualized and disaggregated RAN environment. So as discussed, the notion of edge compute for low latency connectivity, that goes hand in hand with the fact that we're able to virtualize parts of the implementation. So the fact that we absolutely have the DU and RU and then the split with the CU, that's enabling a more efficient, cost-effective 5G deployments. So the fact that we've moved from a more traditional 3G type evolution in terms of deployment through Cloud RAN and now into virtualization, that's something that's going to enable this continued transition to what we call infrastructure 2.0, where the way that infrastructure gets deployed, the sort of use cases we can enable is much more flexible and scalable because we're able to bring together a wider number of platforms in a more cost-effective way. And when we look at 5G from the use case standpoint, it's very important to understand this evolution stemming from mobility, whether it was smartphones into fixed wireless, laptops, automotive, and that's only continuing further. So when we look at the timeline and the shifting of 5G into 6G, one of the interesting questions we're already debating a little bit is that mobile broadband evolution. So all the new techniques coming in mobile broadband in the 5G evolution, and when will certain industries be fully adopting of 5G? So we have the 5G mobility adoption, and so we're still waiting for the full industrial IoT to take off based on that release 16 content. So the continued investment in these new types of deployments, whether it's a private network, an industrial network, something focused on medical applications, is going to keep playing out. And when we take a longer term view, we really do view this transition from 5G into 6G about this merging of the worlds. So we look at the physical world, where we have devices connected, to the digital world, where data and the value proposition of understanding that data and exchanging that data, and then the virtual world, which is enabling really new computing interfaces, the era of spatial computing. So from an academic research standpoint, the intersection of not only the data processing and machine learning, but also the user interface in the virtual world. This really enables us for what we call a new human interface, where we're going to make people more productive. They're going to be able to interact more holistically, leveraging this technology. So we're very excited about this evolution and this intersection of these three worlds. And when we look at something that's going to start playing out in our view in release 18 and beyond, is a much more significant use of machine learning into wireless itself. So not only data collection, stuff that's already happening in release 15, 16, RAN 2, RAN 3, but stuff taking an end-to-end approach to a data-driven wireless system design. In our view, this is going to be something that's very key to the 5G evolution in subsequent releases and subsequent implementations, but also it's going to be core and really implemented directly into the 6G system. And so not only is it about implementation on the network side or implementation with low power AI on the device, but also a machine learning air interface itself, where how we're approaching dynamic air interface adaptation or joint training and model sharing. So we're very optimistic about this continued application of machine learning and really taking data from the statistical realm into the data-driven realm. When we look at this evolution then, we see not only the expansion from release 15 into 16 and 17, where we took 5G from basic smartphones into a large number of industrial applications. When we look at release 18, 19, 20, there's a lot of interesting stuff, whether it's full duplex or even higher bands, 70, 80, 90 gigahertz. We're doing research on bands like 140 gigahertz. Things of enhancing positioning and intelligent surfaces. So what's exciting is the role of sensing, communications, and positioning and ranging. Those are all merging in some sense because of the role that localization plays in these future applications. So we're kind of optimistic about what's going to be occurring on the radio side related to those technologies. And at the same time, the role of cloud is only going to get larger, the role of edge cloud, the role of disaggregation and edge cloud. And that's going to enable new approaches to ultra-secure communications and new spectrum sharing paradigms. So this kind of foundational research, some of it's going to end up in 5G evolution, and some of it will be put into a more holistic approach in 6G itself. So when we look at kind of just a recap on that timeline, and as we'll further discuss in the panel, there's a lot of roadmap ahead for 5G. we're just finished release 16. We're in the middle of release 17. And a lot of these interesting technologies in release 18, 19, 20 are going to be enabling 5G to take that next really big step. And so what's exciting then is those foundational research ideas are also going to be able to something that can drive a new 6G air interface. But that's probably, in our view, something that's typically 10 years between these generations because of that big investment cycle. And also because the fact that 5G itself is much more scalable and flexible. It can absorb a lot of change. It can absorb a lot of evolution in terms of how things are implemented. So at this point, I'm going to hand it off to my good friend, Charlie Zhang, who's the Senior VP at Samsung Research America, leading the research and standardization teams here in the US. So Charlie, I'll stop sharing and then please go ahead and take it away.